friends.
So we stand in support of everyone touched by cancer and say, I am Jimmy.
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 Support the Jimmy Fund.
Text Jimmy to 20222 to donate.
Wednesday morning on News Center 5 IFN are heading into an unsettled stretch when we could see some much needed rain.
And divorcing your credit card.
When to make the call and how to make it happen. Wednesday starting at 4:30 a.m.
For flawless roofing and building, MassTech is your solution. For decades, we've provided the best materials and installation for your roof replacement, addition, or new construction. Currently offering 12 months of 0% financing, MassTech Roofing and Building Company, where your creativity is our reality.
Reopening Massachusetts. Big steps announced at 11.
As the coronavirus made its way to the United States, Asian Americans sounded an alarm.
We told everybody who would listen that this was going to lead to a disaster, and it did.
A rise in hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, killed, beaten, and harassed across the country and here in Massachusetts.
They spit on me and then they just drove away.
Crimes that are typically underreported.
There are incidents of hate and hate crimes probably on a daily basis. But we received too few reports of those hate crimes.
Attacks against these communities are nothing new.
About 2.1 million people were killed during the genocide.
Tonight, the AAPI community in our area shares stories of struggle.
And really just tried to assimilate as much as I could.
Harrowing tales of hard work and hope.
Everyone in my family wanted to wait for America, the land of opportunity.
Young activists fighting for change.
I view this more as a moral obligation.
Local leaders with plans for the future.
I don't think that we're going to be able to solve the problem of racism against Asians unless we solve the problem of racism against all people.
And calls for action.
How loud would you yell if you witnessed such an outrage?
From WCVB, News Center 5, and Chronicle, Project Community, Asian American Voices.
Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Maria Stefanos.
And I'm Ed Harding, and we're joined by anchors Antoinette Antonio and Sean Chayabad for this important program. We hope you can stay with us for the next hour.
Attacks against the AAPI community have captured public attention over the last year, but this violence is not new.
AAPI stands for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We make up 6% of the U.S. population and about 7% of the population in Massachusetts.
Asian Americans are a vital part of our history.
But they've also often become targets.
Recent publicized incidents of violence are lifting the veil on decades of racism and hate. More than a year ago, on March 12, 2020, Asian American leaders stood on the steps of the Massachusetts State House to sound an alarm.
We don't tolerate any kind of bigotry targeted at anyone because of this infection.
They warned of what could come of the continued use of racially charged terms for COVID-19, but no one knew how bad it would get. Asian Americans are under attack across the country right now, but many will tell you this racism is nothing new.
I think it's just the rest of America waking up to the reality of it and finally hearing our cries.
Sam Nguyen is the chairperson of Massachusetts Asian American Commission.
We told everybody who would listen that this was going to lead to a disaster, and it did.
From microaggressions to verbal harassment, some cases turning violent. Asians have been beaten, knocked to the ground, even killed.
He never wake up again. I never see him again.
The spa shootings in Atlanta that left 8 people dead, including 6 Asian women, a boiling point for Asian Americans.
I do absolutely believe that society has failed the Asian American community.
Many asking, how did we get here? And how do we stop Asian hate? First, we have to recognize that it's happening. 14-year-old Denise says she was targeted while walking down the street in her neighborhood outside Boston.
A car pulled up next to me and the passenger window opened, and then the person, they spit on me, and then they just drove away.
That shocking attack has forced the 8th grader to change the way she lives her life, to try and protect herself.
Now I have to be very cautious about my surroundings and with the people who I talk to. If I'm by myself, I usually am on the phone with someone, or I'm holding my keys really tightly in my hands. In Chinese, we call America Mei Guo. You know, Mei means beautiful. So we always thought of America as a beautiful country, but as I have grown, I've seen more of like the ugly side of America with racism.
Someone just rounded the corner, accidentally made eye contact with my daughter and said, "What are you looking at?" And then he's telling me, "Go back to China." I was born here. What do you mean go back to China? I thought I was going to be hit. He grabbed the chair and he picked it up to swing at me.
Sharon Mann says she was the target of 2 racist incidents just days apart, one in February in New York City, the other in Boston's Chinatown.
It does exist here in Massachusetts. I'm in line getting Chinese food, he's in line getting Chinese food, but then he went on with, "I hate Chinese people, look at all these Chinese."
Mann and others believe former President Trump's rhetoric over the last year added fuel to an already blazing fire of racism.
Chinese virus. China virus. Kung flu. Yeah.
In the first year of the pandemic, nearly 3,800 hate incidents targeting Asian Americans were reported across the country. According to the data from Stop AAPI Hate, 96 cases were right here in Massachusetts.
When you speak to other people out in the community, are there people that are living in fear right now?
Yeah, there are. I think there's definitely lots of fear, lots of uncertainties. What happened last few weeks wasn't just happening last few weeks. We knew that. We knew that it had been happening for a long, long time, right?
But the data doesn't help depict that painful history. Attacks are grossly underreported for a number of reasons: language barriers, government mistrust, and cultural reasons.
We grew up learning to be, in a way, invisible, right? Parents and family taught, silence is golden, just swallow the pride, don't voice your opinion.
Philip Chong is the president and CEO of Quincy Asian Resources, a nonprofit organization that provides social services to immigrants. Located in the city with the largest population of Asian Americans per capita in Massachusetts.
As an Asian, I never thought about being majority, and that really inspired me in terms of what I can do.
Ahead of a recent public forum on anti-Asian violence, he received about 100 reports of racist acts in the Quincy community alone.
What did the emails say? What
Asian invasion, you're bad, you stole our job, you ruined our community, you jack up the house pricing.
Being Asian American in this country is a unique and complex experience. Many, myself included, will tell you that at times we feel like a foreigner right here in our own country. Forgotten, the invisible minority. And those feelings have now turned into fear over this past year with the rise in anti-Asian sentiment. A lot of Asian Americans will also tell you now is the time to fight back. And that fight includes speaking up and making sure others do the same.
When you see something, you should say something. A guy came in at the exit of the place we were buying food from, and he said, "I had your back the whole time." It was so nice because that day I didn't feel alone.
Definitely speak up. That's a really important thing, because by speaking up, you're raising awareness of this issue.
I would say for other communities that are not part of the Asian American community, to listen to us, to hear our stories, to not buy into just the stereotypes that you have been fed by the model minority myth. Not just go eat our food, not just embrace our culture, not just listen to our music, but actually have that conversation with us.
It's a long journey, but if we don't do it right now, it's going to happen again. I've seen the mark we have moved so far, compared to 20 years ago, 30 years ago, or the long history. But we need to keep going.
It's very powerful, Antoinette. This hate was essentially hidden across history. So what's changed now to finally bring the attention that it deserves?
Well, that's a really good question, Ed, and there's really no simple answer to that question. A lot of people believe that the anti-Asian rhetoric that some political leaders have used to describe COVID has really tapped into this country's history of racism, exclusion, and othering of Asian Americans. But as you just heard, a lot of us have actually been experiencing this since well before COVID-19. I think we're hearing about the harassment and the violence because of a movement that's happening right now. Largely, that movement is happening on social media. So I follow several different accounts that are dedicated to Asian American news, and I see this violence happening almost every day across this country, which means more people are standing up and speaking out, and the more people speak out, then the more people speak out, whether it be to journalists or even to police. And that is a new trend that I think will continue.
So well before COVID, you said, Antoinette, well before COVID.
Well before COVID. This racism is nothing new. Most Asian Americans will tell you that.
And Sean, working on all of this, we're hearing that the experiences of younger people now, do you think that they're better or different than their parents or their grandparents?
Well, Maria, I can tell you that while laws may have changed to better support people of color, it's evident that some of these racial biases, they're deeply ingrained in this country. And for Asian Americans, they're often overlooked. And because these stereotypes are not confronted, Asian Americans tend to feel like foreigners in their own land, when in fact many families have been in this country for generations. Now, these stereotypes give license oftentimes to people to discriminate and hate.
This is a discussion we will definitely keep going throughout this hour.
And as we have mentioned, these crimes are largely underreported and not always prosecuted as what they are, hate crimes. Right now, 47 states in the union, including Massachusetts, have hate crime laws, which add additional penalties when race, ethnicity, or sexual orientation are a factor in those crimes. 5 Investigates' Mike Bodette digs into what hate crime data does and does not tell us.
They're part of the fabric of Massachusetts. Our state is home to nearly 500,000 Asian Americans. But 2021 has presented all of us with a cruel reminder of what many of them face on a regular basis: hate. Sometimes it's subtle, sometimes it's not.
A friend of mine was targeted and his car was painted with racist graffiti. Not once, twice.
My tires were slashed.
These people agreed to share their experiences with us about living in Massachusetts.
When the pandemic first started, I went to Lowe's, and then there was a man who came to me, and he was like, next time there's a virus, just let us know ahead of time.
People just look at us, say, okay, give you a label, Asian.
And we heard that many times, go back to your country.
We took an in-depth look at the data, analyzing more than 2,000 hate crimes reported from around the state, finding nearly 100 incidents targeting people of Asian or Pacific Islander descent during a 6-year period. They're happening all over eastern Massachusetts, where the state's Asian population mostly lives. They're coded by the type of offense, and include intimidation, simple assault, or aggravated assault. Behind the numbers, you'll find hate and rage, including unprovoked attacks by strangers. While waiting for a bus, she looked up from her phone and she was punched in the face. Walking on a crosswalk, he called her an expletive and spit on her arm and said, "Go eat some rice." In a restaurant, a person targeting Asian customers shouting racially motivated obscenities such as expletive Koreans. And in a nail salon, someone called her an ungrateful expletive for what Vietnam vets did for her. And there's this graffiti on a middle school wall. Disturbing stories, but only a fraction of what's really happening, according to Attorney General Maura Healey.
You know, it's sad to me because I know, Mike, that there are incidents of hate and hate crimes happening around our state, probably on a daily basis. But we receive too few reports of those hate crimes.
Healey is pushing for legislative changes on the state and federal level.
Number one, we need to make sure that our laws are clear. I filed legislation here in Massachusetts to make really clear definitions of what is a hate crime, to make it easier for police and prosecutors to bring these cases. And then we need to monitor the trends and have better data. And that's why I support the federal no hate legislation that's currently pending.
The state data we reviewed showed no hate crimes against Asian Americans in Lowell and only one in Lynn from 2014 to 2019. Two communities with some of the larger Asian populations in the state.
Do those numbers make sense?
No, and this is part of the problem, right? Because surely there are hate incidents happening in those communities as they're happening across the Commonwealth.
Sanjay Cole is vice president of the World Hindu Council of America and a first-generation Indian American.
The reason may be that the Asian Americans may be reluctant to contact law enforcement for a variety of reasons that can include language or cultural barriers, distrust of police, or just a fear of repercussion.
We asked the group about the renewed focus aimed at giving Asian Americans a voice and the respect they deserve.
I'm not really very hopeful. I'm quite cynical about all of this because underneath that is still the language of hate.
Any discrimination or hate will not go away overnight. There has to be systematic change.
I think it's time for people to educate themselves, widen their horizon, and learn about other countries, other people, other cultures, and be more welcoming and more accommodating.
Official data for 2020 isn't in yet, but one report says Boston has experienced a dramatic increase in anti-Asian hate crimes. The Attorney General has a hate crime hotline, and she's urging people to contact her office to report any incidents of hate. You can also call your local police department. Mike Bodette, 5 Investigates.
Next, the local history of Asian Americans. Some arrived centuries ago, others are new immigrants by choice.
There's no one story for Asian Americans in Massachusetts.
The bonds they formed throughout Massachusetts communities.
And conversations across generations, how bias has impacted life stories.
I came here on my own with a tag on my lapel that says Boston, Massachusetts.
My story is not unique. They're valid, and their emotions and their story are truth.
Project Community, Asian American.
Welcome back. The history of Asian Americans in Massachusetts dates back to the 1870s when the first Chinese immigrants settled in Boston and Western Massachusetts, moving here from the West Coast to work in factories.
In the years that followed, immigrants from other areas of Asia and the Pacific began to settle here in the Commonwealth.
Chronicle's Anthony Everett shows us the tight-knit communities they've built.
I have been living in the city since 1987 as a proud Cambodian refugee.
The secret bombing of Laos, I'm a result of that because they bombed my country.
These are stories of Asian Americans in the Commonwealth. Their stories, like the countries they come from, are distinct and unique. UMass Boston Asian American Studies professor, Dr. Shirley Tang.
There's no one story for Asian Americans in Massachusetts. The 5 largest Asian American groups statewide are Chinese, Indians, Vietnamese, Koreans, and Cambodians. They all have important histories and contributions, and they all come here for various reasons.
There is a lot of history to draw from, but very little made its way into the general knowledge and teaching until recently.
In the mid-1990s, for all public K-12 schools, the history and social studies curriculum had no content related to Asian Americans.
UMass Lowell Associate Professor Pitsamai Oy says even well-documented contributions by Asian Americans in this country have been systematically played down.
The Chinese helped build the transatlantic railway, 15 to 20,000 railroad workers. But when we had that golden spike, none of them were pictured, right? Because they didn't want them.
The they in this case is the U.S. government. They didn't want Asian immigrants, says Pitsame, and enacted several laws against them, including the 1875 Page Act that claimed Asian women were lewd and immoral, followed by the Chinese Exclusion Act, which halted Asian immigration altogether.
Dennis Kearney, the California-based leader of the Chinese Exclusion Campaign. So on Boston Common, he actually rallied a crowd by shouting, "Are the Chinamen to occupy this country, or the white man?"
Despite this institutionalized racism, first-generation Asian Americans made their way to Boston at the turn of the last century, including the grandfather of 97-year-old Chinatown social work legend, Auntie Amy Nguyen.
My grandfather came to Boston in 1885. His profession was herbal medicine. It is now just called a drugstore. When I was a child, they would congregate in these herbal stores for sending money back to China. That is why we have the Chin Clan Association in Boston.
These early family-based associations, many of which are still around today, were key to providing the support necessary for the Chinese community to survive. In the 1980s, Cambodian and Laotian immigrants formed community-based mutual assistance associations that were at the cornerstone of their lives.
My name is Savannah Poe, identifies he, him, his, and I am the Executive Director of the Cambodian Mutual Assistance Association. Our mission is to improve the quality of life for Cambodian Americans and other ethnic minority groups through cultural, economic, social, and financial programs.
I don't know what to do.
Long before Savannah was the director here, he was the child of parents escaping a violent genocide.
About 2.1 million people were killed during the genocide, and the individuals that were killed were highly educated. So when you have a quarter of your community killed, it's really hard to kind of come back from that.
Resettling Southeast Asian refugees was important to the United States. Professor Oy says it was America's way of atoning for past sins.
200 million tons of bombs were dropped in Laos from 1963 to 1974. The Cold War was happening. It was communist versus democracy. There were also civil wars in Laos and Cambodia. The rationale for the bombing is we're going to stop the military route of the Chinese Communist Party supporting the Vietnamese military.
The refugee crisis that followed led to the 1980 Refugee Act, which placed Southeast Asians in all 50 states. As the daughter of Laotian immigrants, Professor Oy received an early education on the lives of refugees in America.
My father and my mother got $400 to live. My dad worked for a woolen mill, and my mom worked for plastic molding.
Areas with opportunity for factory jobs, often without language requirements, sparked a second migration to manufacturing towns like Lowell and Lynn. The support offered by Catholic churches contributed to a large Vietnamese community settling in Fields Corner.
We have the largest Vietnamese population in New England. You see Vietnamese small businesses like the one that we're at right now. So it's really been the heart for the Vietnamese community.
Working class Southeast Asian communities are pushing data equity, or the understanding that Asian Americans are not one monolithic group.
In 2013, the Pew study came out. Asian Americans are the fastest rising. They have the highest education level, the highest income. They did not look at the Southeast Asian and the Pacific Islanders. Our poverty rate for our Hmong community is 3 times the rate of the average white families.
National foundation money, less than 1% goes to Asian American serving organizations. Now, how do you fight that issue? You gotta have information to reflect the data that actually exists.
The history of Asian Americans in the Commonwealth is as diverse as the communities they have formed.
That was Anthony Everett reporting. As he mentioned, there is no one Asian American community in the country or here in Massachusetts.
Each person's story is as diverse as the countries from which they come. However, there is one shared experience, and that is racism.
If you talk with older or younger generations, you'll find racism has been a part of growing up and living in Massachusetts.
And we wanted to hear about the impact of those very experiences. Our Sarah Kanji spoke with a recent college grad who grew up in Framingham.
And I spent some time with a former school teacher and principal who made her way to Boston 6 decades ago.
I'm Suzanne Lee. I'm first generation Chinese American, and I've been in Boston since 1961.
What was that year like for you when you moved here?
I came here on my own with a tag on my lapel that says Boston, Massachusetts. They put me on a plane, and there I go. And it was the first time that I ever met my father, and I have not seen my mother since I was 6 years old.
Why did your family come to the United States and leave you behind?
It's my family story. It's also similar to a lot of families in that generation. In the old days, women cannot come legally to the U.S. It's part of the immigration law.
Essentially, your family was broken apart because of federal law.
The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, that was the first time they ever passed a federal law that exclude an ethnic group. The only time. It says that all Chinese cannot come, except for if you're a scholar or a business person, but nobody can become a citizen. So if you're not a citizen, then you can't bring your family here. And that law existed until after World War II.
It wasn't just to say, we only want you here to work, but by excluding women, you couldn't grow roots.
That's
you
right.
wouldn't be able to have Chinese families in these communities.
It is the ingenious piece of legislation. It did what it meant to do. That don't want the Chinese to be here permanently.
That's ingrained racism, would you say?
Institutionalized, and it's done by the government. And it sets the tone. It sets the tone of how the rest of the population will see the Chinese, that they are foreigners. My father has been here since 1938. And my grandfather has been here since 1887. In normal circumstances, I would have been third generation. So you're constantly aware that you are in somebody else's house. You are in somebody else's country. Whether or not that is true or not, but that's how ingrained it is.
We have seen this rash of hate crimes against Asian Americans all across this country. Is it new?
The biggest lynching in the U.S. history was in LA, Chinatown. 18 men were lynched.
I think most Americans don't know that.
Yes, because that history is not taught. It's not seen as part of American history.
When you hear of this recent violence against Asian Americans, what goes through your head?
People see you a certain way. And when the government have these kind of policy and set this tone, it gives license to people to do whatever they want. There is a scapegoat, just like the 1882 Exclusion Act. That was for economic reason. For the Japanese internment camp, that was because of the foreign war. When we have the Vietnam War, again, Asians were targeted because when the soldiers come home, they can't tell the difference between who's who. You look Asian, you're the enemy. So now, with the pandemic, when you have people in government, particularly a president that keeps saying this is a Chinese virus, it makes people feel like it's okay. Last October, I was walking down the street, somebody followed me and yelling behind me, "We should never have let your kind in here. You brought us the virus."
For people who aren't Asian American, they haven't experienced the microaggressions that happen on a daily basis, how can we better explain what happens and what can change?
I think we do have to start from history. When people don't know that you've been here that long, that you are part of the country, they feel like they can do that to you. We have to be telling those stories. We have to be teaching that kind of history in our school curriculum. This is not Asian history. This is American history.
I'm Jeff Chan. I'm 23 years old from Framingham, Massachusetts, and I'm a second-generation Chinese American. And my mom was born here in Massachusetts, in Brookline. My dad immigrated here when he was about 1 or 2 from China.
When you were going to school here in Framingham, what was that like? Were there other Asian American students?
From the Asian perspective, there weren't too many of us.
Did you ever experience any racism? Did you ever experience any hate?
At every stage of my life, yes. Whether that be a student or a classmate trying to imitate speaking Chinese to me, even though I never even spoke it at all. And then also just having racial slurs thrown at me as well in the classroom and also outside of the classroom.
What impact has that had on you?
It made me feel like I would have to really downplay my ethnic identity. I really pushed myself to try and fit in no matter what, even if that was at the cost of hiding what I actually had a genuine interest in. So that could have been TV shows we were watching, movies we were watching, songs we were listening to, or just like even keeping up with sports as well.
Because you thought some of that was too Asian? You thought it might not be American enough?
At that age, yes. It was mostly just trying to fit in with the white students and basically trying to fit into, because I saw them as like the powerful group.
There was a time when I was a kid, I told you I'm half Chinese, it's my mother and my grandmother. I called my grandmother boo-boo. That's what you call your grandmother. And I naturally said it in school among my friends, and I realized that was a mistake. It's those little things you kind of have to keep to yourself.
Yeah. I would say I felt like I faced the same exact challenges and struggles too. Like I would consciously choose what I went into my lunchbox and then try not to have like the Asian snacks that I would have at home, like after school, and then really just like try to assimilate as much as I could and have the same lunchbox as the white students in my classes had.
Did you ever share this with your parents or your grandparents, and did they ever give you any advice as to how to handle it?
I would say they grew up in a very survivalistic mindset where they were just as long as you have a financially steady background, then that's all that matters.
You've seen and heard all these things that are happening now. How are you feeling as a Chinese American, as an Asian American in the US?
I have really mixed feelings about it, I would say. So on one hand, I'm really glad that we're getting this exposure, but then again, I feel really exhausted about it too, because this has been a persistent issue. Like the typical, stereotypical Asian American is that we're passive. We don't have any emotions at all. So then we just take and take and take everything, and they know that we're not going to say anything about that.
Do you think that's going to change now that there is kind of this awakening?
I hope so. I think that's the most important thing that will come out of this racial reckoning from the summer 2020, and just realize that Asian people are not a monolith. We are diverse. We are complex. We're more than just what they say we are on paper.
Jeff, why did you want to speak out, and why did you agree to talk with us today?
My story is not unique. There's so many other people out there like me who have had the same experience as me, but I've never been able to hear that story. I've never been able to see that story. Just having that vulnerability and that strength and the courage and the bravery to really put my story out there. I'm hoping that that'll put people in the same situations as me, whether they're older, younger, just to know that they're valid and their emotions and their story are truth.
Our thanks to Sarah Kanji and to Jeff and Suzanne for sharing their stories.
Great discussion. Learning about and understanding the crisis of hate and racism is only the first step in putting a stop to it. We have seen this pandemic deepen and expose crises that were already here long before COVID-19. Coming up, a panel of local leaders weigh in on the issues.
We have to understand and identify racism that's embedded throughout our culture.
And share their hopes for the future.
I'm very optimistic, although it's going to be a long battle.
Project Community, Asian.
With more people acknowledging the violence against Asian Americans, how do you reach long-lasting solutions?
WCVB's Janet Wu is taking that question to community leaders in Massachusetts. Janet.
Sean and Ed, we have 4 community leaders with us. Boston City Councilor Michelle Wu, State Representative Tacky Chan, Paul Lee, an attorney and community activist, and Angie Liu, Executive Director of the Asian Community Development Corporation. Paul, I'm going to start with you. You're a Bostonian in the true sense of the label. Racism against Asians here isn't new by any means, but what are you seeing right now that's different, if it is different, and does it give you hope or make you a little bit more fearful?
I think that the moment is very different. I think this time around we have much more power and influence. A lot of people are comparing this moment to 1982 when Vincent Chin, a Chinese American, was murdered by two white Detroit auto workers who thought he was Japanese, and they thought the Japanese automakers were responsible for the loss of their jobs. And what that did was that woke up the Asian American community to the fact that whether you're Japanese or Chinese American or Korean American, we all look alike. And so we had to come together and defend ourselves. Unfortunately, at that time, we didn't have the power and the influence. Fast forward to nearly 40 years later now, we have, immigrants, we have children of immigrants who have grown up, gone to college, and achieved success. And so we have a voice. And I think, this time around, I think we're much stronger and we can advocate for ourselves.
Michelle, do you see a difference now? Do you feel that things may be different than it was for my generation, for Paul's generation?
So many of the feelings that I have had as a daughter of immigrants and an Asian American, as we've seen the news of an ongoing acceleration of the violence and hatred and anti-Asian racism, has resurfaced a lot of my childhood experiences from strangers approaching my family and me out in public, yelling slurs or making other motions that were racist. But I do agree that in this moment, there's such a nationwide awakening, a citywide awakening about the importance of standing together against racism, period, right? Across ethnic groups, across our entire community. And I'm so excited and energized to see that there's a moment not just to push back individual by individual, but really in a systemic way, and to talk about the long-term stabilization, the policies we need so that everybody is safe and healthy and happy.
This show itself shows a degree of optimism because, as Paul correctly points out, it's very quickly how we disappeared from the news media and conversation. So continued conversations in this format beyond just political and community leadership is essential. Having this a chance to converse is very heartening.
Angie, racism is more than hateful words or dangerous encounters on the street. What else do you and the community see that reveals the sort of like deeply embedded problems that Asians confront daily?
When we think about systemic racism, it's the systems of the lack of language access, the lack of affordable housing and housing stability, the lack of appropriate workforce development and support so that people can get well-paid jobs and to be able to maintain their financial well-being. So all these factors contribute to the systemic racism and oppression that our communities suffer on a daily basis. And that's very hard to see.
Michelle, during the pandemic, reported hate crimes decreased by 14% in Boston, but anti-Asian hate crimes, which were reported, nearly doubled. Some people blame the former president for granting permission to act out with remorse. Do you agree, or are there also other factors involved here?
Prior to the virus even really spreading in the United States, we were already feeling the impacts here in Chinatown and in Asian American communities across the country, where business was down 60%, 70% more. And it was because misinformation, racism, xenophobia was being fueled by leaders at the highest levels in our government. Even though there's been more awareness, even though there has been heightened attention and now more counting and monitoring, we are still undercounting. We are still not catching all of the incidents, and this has already been part of a long-standing pattern where the Asian American community has experienced this for a long time, not just through the pandemic.
Angie, where do you think this all comes from?
There is a long history of xenophobia and systemic racism against Asians from the very moment that we set foot on this land. So while former President Trump contributed to the rhetoric, this is nothing new. I mean, we think about this country, from the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act to the rounding up of Japanese American citizens to internment camps during World War II. We cannot point to the root of this racism to any single politician, and we have to acknowledge that it is deeply, deeply embedded in the foundation of this country.
Let's talk a little bit about what government can do. Tacky, Congress is pushing through a bill to confront Asian hate crimes. Is it a good bill? And if so, what should also be done by Massachusetts in the legislature where you serve, if anything?
You know, it's the first time in my mind that something positive actually moved through Congress for this end of the community. Throughout COVID-19, pretty much we were ignored by Washington, and as we all struggled at local level. And my level of government, we're talking about things like updating the hate crimes law to look at the totality of circumstances. We want to avoid an Atlanta situation where they claim sex addiction as a motive for shooting 6 Asian women and accusing them of prostitution on a false basis. There are multiple bills on ethnic education in our school system. I looked at my history book when I was a child and saw less than 4 paragraphs, more like 10 sentences about Japanese internment camps. They're not really detailing out, what actually happened in that time period. We need to change our education system.
Traditionally, the Asian culture didn't encourage speaking up or speaking out when confronted with violence, discrimination, or public displays of scorn. That's starting to change with the new generation of leaders, but how do you encourage the older generation to feel safe and to, begin speaking out?
I think that that's really hard. I mean, a lot of the older generation are immigrants, and they come to this country with the attitude that it's a privilege for them to be here, so they don't want to complain, they don't want to call attention to themselves. I'm talking about my parents now, both immigrants from China, and and that's what they taught us. They said, keep your head down, don't draw attention to yourself, and and really of relevance to me was they said, don't be number 1 in your class. Be number 2, because if you're number 1, then they're going to come after you. I think one of the great things that's occurred with this pandemic and with the Stop AAPI Hate is that we're seeing youth, high school youth in particular, who are speaking out. And I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that they have been bullied, microaggressed, stereotyped throughout their days in school. And they're all kind of feeling like this, we don't want to do this anymore. We don't want to be subjected to this anymore.
How confident are you that things will change, that Asians will speak up, and the level of disdain, the divisiveness, and the scorn, never mind the violence and words of unprovoked hate that they encounter today will actually dwindle?
I do think that this time, this moment does feel different because we're coming onto this crest in the aftermath of the Black Lives Movement last summer. And so I do think this time around, more Asian Americans are realizing that we have to work together with other communities of color. We have to work at the root causes of systemic racism, and we cannot afford to stand divided.
Jackie, are you equally optimistic?
I see this as a continuing issue right into 2022 through the pandemic, and correctly pointed out that DC needs to change its tone, as well as the media, regarding the Asian American community. It's great to have attention now, but my question to my intimate community is very simple. Where were you 16 months ago? So to have trust in government needs to do its job. And people like myself should be held accountable, and the 8 members of the House Asian Caucus, which is the largest minority group in the House of Representatives now. It's not Black, it's not Latino. Asians are the biggest minority group in the House of Representatives, have to lead.
What's the bottom line for you, Michelle?
We have been through so devastating, such a tough year through the pandemic across every group. We have seen this pandemic deepen and expose crises that were already here long before COVID-19. What we need to do moving forward is make sure that we are not just putting Band-Aids on situations, but actually addressing the underlying issues. I have faith, right? I am driven to make sure that whatever we can do in this moment, we have the power to change policies that can actually make a difference. And even more importantly, we have the power to bring everyone into the conversation.
Paul, I'll give you the final word. You have seen what's been going on longer than anyone else. How optimistic are you?
I don't think that we're going to be able to solve the problem of racism against Asians unless we solve the problem of racism against all people. It's not acceptable to allow our society to structure this so that different communities of color are vying for each other, against each other, to not be at the bottom of the totem pole. We should all be lifted up together, and we should all work together, because that's the only way we're going to eliminate racism in our society.
This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you all for joining us. And Sean, we'll go back to you.
Thank you, Wu, and that has been truly a great discussion.
Yeah, a discussion that we really have to keep on going. Well, you just heard it. Activism has an important role in equality.
And there is a movement underway.
Right. Change starts at the local level.
Coming up, the fight for change.
They gathered, they organized.
I see that the younger generation is working really hard to pull together.
And later, Ted Reinstein with a call to action.
For what else is violence fueled by bigotry, if not terrorism? And what else is silence, if not complicity?
Project Community, Asian.
So here we are, after more than a century of exclusion and mistreatment. How do you begin to achieve change?
One way is this conversation that we're all here having right now. Another way is choosing to no longer stay silent.
And some of the loudest voices right now are coming from younger generations.
Chronicle's Shayna Seymour shows us the local movements that are gaining momentum.
Protests like this one in Boston are often the front line for activists. The headlines about hate crimes spurred one local 18-year-old to start organizing. Doan Nguyen is a rising sophomore at Harvard. He launched the Stop Asian Hate social media movement that's become a global rallying cry.
Originally, I was just planning on creating the Stop Asian Hate Boston rally. It grew to be even larger. We've seen Stop Asian Hate New York City, San Diego, Toronto, Dallas, Pittsburgh, Amsterdam, London, and a million more.
Nguyen grew up in Boston and Westboro. His parents and extended family came to the U.S. as refugees from Vietnam.
Everyone worked in my family to get here. They wanted to wait for America, the land of hope, of opportunity, of peace, and of safety.
The violence committed against so many elderly immigrants in particular shook Nguyen to his core.
They waited for so long, fought so hard to come to a country that promised them peace, and they can't even have that basic right as a human being.
Nguyen says the Stop Asian Hate Coalition is working to create a nonprofit to continue outreach.
How can people help and support this movement?
Change starts at the local level. It starts with having conversations. We can also support AAPI-owned businesses, especially in Chinatown, because those have been hit terribly by the pandemic. Our voice is so strong and so powerful and so impactful, but only when we use it.
Are you proud of what you've been able to accomplish?
I view this more as a moral obligation. If I didn't do this, I couldn't sit still.
Art and activism are often intertwined.
I feel like maybe art has kind of that special power to move people. Just because of how you engage with it, you can kind of take some time with it. Some of these are rally posters. This is a photo of a mural that I painted.
Malden-based Shayna Liu is a teacher, illustrator, muralist, and photographer.
This one I made for Asian American Resource Workshop and kind of honoring people that were murdered by hate violence.
Liu's work, whether lighthearted or serious, often reflects her experience as a Taiwanese American. This 2016 comic depicts a frightening encounter.
I was going to Chinatown and a man was muttering about Chinamen on the T, and then he walked up to me. I was the only Asian person on the train at the time, and then he was just shouting at me, and it was about for 30 minutes. I was trapped in the car with this guy, and everybody was sitting around me and filming it.
Liu teaches art to students from grades K through 8, encouraging them to think hard about what and why they create.
One of the projects that they do is research a social justice topic that really matters to them, and then they kind of make a piece of media art that reflects that and advocates for the change that they want to see. Some of the work can serve as windows and mirrors in the sense that kids can kind of either see themselves or see somebody else kind of reflected in that story.
Youth groups often attract dedicated community organizers.
Do you want to talk a little bit about...
Vanny Hewitt and Sandy Wright are co-directors of Revere Youth in Action, or RIA.
Revere Youth in Action is pretty much a youth center without walls and a space for youth to really
amplify their voice.
In Revere, communities of color have seen their share of tough times, says Nguyen.
Back in the 80s, we had a huge Cambodian refugee population. They had faced a lot of anti-Asian violence and racism.
Today, Revere Youth in Action is a cross-racial organization advocating for social justice, including voting rights and affordable housing.
When youth in our community were outraged by the lack of response around Black Lives Matter from our local leaders to a response on a national scale, they gathered, they organized. Our liberation is tied to one another.
RIA member Shema Mansour Hosseini agrees.
It just shows that we have each other's back. As someone who wants to be a physician in the future, it's my job to take care of all human beings, and this is the first step when it comes to it.
I see that the younger generation is working really hard to pull together that say, no, we have the same mission. There are strength in numbers.
Veteran WCVB reporter Janet Wu is one of the best-known political and investigative journalists in the region.
Debate is expected to begin on the floor.
As a pioneer for Asian American journalists, Wu remembers how different it was at the start of her career.
When I first started at the State House in 1975, there were only 2 other women reporters. There were no reporters of color. And it was a very tough time because none of them men, and they were mostly white male politicians, wanted to talk to me.
The irony of being seen as other was not lost on Wu. Her great-grandfather was brought to the U.S. from China in the 1860s to build the Transcontinental Railroad.
From the time I was little, I was well aware of the establishment's perception of Asians, which is basically dismissiveness, disdain, scorn. Back then, I felt like I had to prove myself that I could cover politics just like any other white male reporter.
For years, mass media often ignored covering the AAPI community in meaningful ways, says Wu. She is hopeful things are changing.
I've been a reporter here for almost 5 decades, and the recognition of something that has been going on and accepted for decades isn't news until it is news, until something fits the political climate. It's now finally being recognized.
And you can get involved by following the Stop Asian Hate account and hashtag on Instagram.
You can also head to Facebook and search for Revere Youth in Action.
Right now, one more perspective on challenging yourself to make a difference.
And it comes from Chronicle's Ted Reinstein. He has a call to action.
One of America's defining characteristics is that, unlike most other countries, it has no ethnic nationality. With the sole exception of Native Americans, we're all from somewhere else. We're all immigrants. Many came by choice, some came in chains, and still others come in any way they can. E pluribus unum. Out of many, one. It says so, right on the money that passes through our fingers. In reality, let's face it, America as a melting pot is a worthy ideal that has never been fulfilled. The bad stuff, like bigotry, has never boiled away. It just boils. Out of many, many have always felt free to lash out at the other among us, at those who came later, look different, sound different, dress different, pray differently, or love differently. Some melting pot. This awful COVID period has been more awful for how it has revisited hate directed at Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Immigrants who, over hundreds of years, have paid in blood and sweat for their own stake in America, having literally helped build it from the ground up and having defended it with their lives. How dare anyone question their standing here? Much less, as in Atlanta, kill them at their workplace or attack their aged grandparents. How loud would you yell if you witnessed such an outrage? Are you sure? Because to see the sickening video of an elderly Asian woman being stomped and kicked on a New York sidewalk is to be doubly sickened. It's equally horrifying to watch several security guards, all watching from the safety of their building lobby mere yards away, say nothing throughout the entire assault until finally acting to close the door to their building. And it's not just New York, it's everywhere, including Boston. And it's not just the AAPI community which has been targeted. The recent past has also seen an across-the-board spike in hate crimes against African Americans, Jews, the Latinx, and the LGBTQ communities. You know, allyship is a great word, but it has to mean more than putting up a sign with a rainbow and a supportive slogan in front of the house. It means, if necessary, speaking up, calling out. That victim in New York? would likely tell you that some voices don't seem to be quite loud enough yet. You know, in the wake of 9/11, in an effort to urge greater public vigilance against terrorism, the slogan, "See something, say something," became commonplace. We all need to take that to heart again. For what else is violence fueled by bigotry, if not terrorism? And what else is silence, if not complicity? I'm Ted Reinstein.
Thanks, Ted. And it bears repeating. See something, say something. One of the most important things you can do.
So if you do see a hate crime in progress, don't hesitate. Immediately call police. Victims of hate crimes can also file a civil rights complaint with the State Attorney General's office by calling 1-800-994-3228.
If you want more information on events to support the AAPI community, just follow the state's Asian American Commission online. And consider taking bystander intervention training offered for free by local groups like Hollaback. You can find more resources in the project community section of our WCVB app. And another thing you can do, I think we can all agree on, is to spread kindness.
That's the final word. Thank you for joining us.
Project Community, Asian American Voices.